It's okay. Now it's okay. It's 4. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, all attendees. So happy to be with you. Our workshop today entitled Assessment Workshop, as you see. To assess our students, we have to discuss this topic together to have the most effective way to assess our students. Our objectives of this workshop is to discuss the different kinds of assessment, the importance of assessment. This is the second objective. The third one, and this is the most important one in our workshop, it will be at the end of the workshop about samples, how to develop an effective assessment for our students and how to implement. Before we start, I'd like to have only one volunteer to tell me how do you usually assess your students and when. Only one volunteer, please. Okay, how do you usually assess your students and when do you usually assess your students? Who can? Only one volunteer, please. How do you usually assess your students and when?
I think it's at the end of the lesson.
Yes, who is talking?
We have periodic assessment, weekly assessment, monthly assessment. At the end of each period, we have an assessment, and it can take different forms depending on what I'm assessing.
This means that every period we usually assess our students. This is the second part of the question. What about the first part? How? How do you usually assess your students?
I usually ask questions.
Okay.
Maybe by a wrap-up question, by to solve a problem, to apply, to ask, to make brainstorming.
Okay, thank you so much. As you see, good teachers are assessing all the time, are assessing their students all the time using a variety of strategies. So, as you have just mentioned, we are assessing our students all the time using a variety or different kinds of assessment strategies. Frankly speaking, or basically, let us say that we have two kinds of assessment, different kinds, two different kinds, the formative assessment and the summative assessment. What's the difference? Concerning formative assessment, we use formative assessment to improve our instruction as a teacher. Instruction here means teaching. So we use formative assessment to improve our teaching methodology, our teaching strategies, and to provide, to give our students feedback about their performance. This is the first use of formative assessment. What about summative? We use summative assessment to measure competency, means to measure our students' ability to do something. So here, formative and their summative, two different kinds of assessment. What's the significant point of the formative? To improve our teaching, to improve our instruction, and to provide our students, to give them, provide them with feedback about their performance, whether or whereas the summative assessment, we use it to measure the competency, the student's ability to do something. What else? As you see here, formative assessment, we use it to be a good impact on our instruction, I mean our teaching. Yes, sometimes when we assess our students, we find that when we have self-assessment, we ask ourselves, have we explained this part effectively as I have prepared in my lesson plan? If I have this point, I mean self-reflection or self-assessment, it participates in improving our instruction or our teaching. This is one of the significant points of the formative assessment. Also, formative assessment is used, as you see, is an assessment for learning, but the summative assessment is assessment of learning. You see here is a so significant point, the use of the preposition, assessment for learning and assessment of learning. How? In the formative assessment, we are assessing our students to test their comprehension, to test their understanding. But in the summative assessment, it's an assessment of learning. This means that we test the students' knowledge, the outcome of the unit, the outcome of the chapter. So this is the difference between the two prepositions, assessment for learning, assessment for understanding. Assessment of learning, assessment to measure the students' knowledge of the lesson. And this is two important points about the difference between formative and summative. Again, formative to test the students' understanding of the lesson, summative to test the students' knowledge of the unit or chapter. We use formative assessment continuously throughout the unit, but summative is used at the end, as I have just mentioned, at the end of the unit, at the end of the chapter, at the end of the month, at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, because it measures the outcome of the student's knowledge, whereas formative assessment used continuously, as our colleague mentioned, each period we are assessing our students. This is the formative assessment. So what is the kind of assessment that we use each period? We use formative assessment. It's being used continuously. Why? To test our students' understanding of the lesson. Okay, just to admit others. Here I have 2 points. How can students use test results and how can teachers use test results? First, we'll start by the students. The formative assessments serve as a gauge, a tool. So students know where they need improvement. This is how students can make use of their test results. They know where they need to improve themselves. If they have formative assessment each period. What about summative? Summative assessments are used to gauge the progress of grade level goals. As you know, we are teaching standard-based. I mean, according to the worldwide standards, especially for the core subjects. The students can measure their skills based on the standards. If they want to make use of the summative assessment, if they want to make use of the formative assessment, they can assess themselves where they need urgent improvement or where they can improve their skills. Now we come to the teachers. How do teachers use assessment results? Concerning formative assessments are used to check for students' comprehension, I mean, for students' understanding of the lesson. Formative assessments are used to check the understanding of the content, whereas the summative assessments are used for grading and promoting the students from each grade level to the next. Here I have a very important point I want to discuss it with you. The intervention programs. It is mainly related to the question, how do teachers use assessment results? In our work, we have conducted assessments and we analyzed the students' results. That's why we started developing or creating the intervention programs. But as I said, it is used to check the students' comprehension or the students' understanding. We noticed, for example, in math, that's why we are discussing assessment. We noticed in math, for example, it specifies the critical points that we should make more focused to improve our students' performance. But in math, we noticed, especially for lower grades, 4, 5, and 6, we started in our intervention plans using the simple mathematical problems. Although, according to our analysis, we need more complicated problems to cover or to improve our students' performance. That's why I said the assessment results participate in covering weakness points of the students. So in math, mainly for grades 4, 5, and 6, I'm talking about the periods that I attended with the teachers. We need to focus to cover the weakness of the students, not all the problems. So here again, how do teachers use assessment results to cover the weakness of the students to improve their performance? Also in English, we analyzed our students' performance. That's why we started creating intervention plans or intervention programs. It was mainly focused on reading. I attended with a lot of teachers. Hopefully and thankfully, they guided their students to read, but this is not enough to improve reading skills. As you know, we have to guide the students to answer questions, to create questions, to make sure that they could understand reading. Again, based on the worldwide standard skills. Also, we noticed in the analysis of the English quizzes that most of the students have a weakness in writing that was, or let me say, hasn't been covered yet in the intervention programs. That's why, again, I repeat the point, how do teachers use assessment results? We analyze the students' results performance, then we start creating the intervention programs to cover, to support the students to improve their weakness. Concerning the summative, it participates to promote the students from each grade level to the next level. What is the importance of the formative assessment? Again, the formative assessment is continuously used without stopping because each period we use to assess and evaluate our students' performance. What's the importance of the formative assessment? Number one, it's a process to show students learning. When I ask my students, I can make sure if he or she could understand my point or points or the lesson. So it's a process to show the students learning, whether it is on track or out of track. Ongoing classroom work. This means that to adopt the formative assessment actively and effectively, we have to ask our students each single period. Again, we have to ask our students each single period. Those who attended with us at the first workshop, we used to divide our period into 3 parts. The first part that we said we have to start by warming up and introducing the vocabulary that we're going to use in our lesson. Then the next part, our instruction, I mean teaching, The third part, the practical part, in this part, we impose questions to ensure that our students could understand the lesson, and we set 3 steps of practice, guided practice that we mentioned at the very beginning of the workshop. Guided practice, I impose a question and answer it, pretending that I am a student, to show my students how to answer the question. The second step in practice, dependent practice, we divide our students into 2 groups. Even virtually, we can divide our students into groups or into pairs. The teacher interferes only to give hints, check the sign, a missing letter, and so on. The third part of the practice in our session or in our period, the independent question, where the teacher imposes a question, leaving her or his students to answer, then he must give his students feedback. That's why I repeat again, assessment, I mean the formative assessment, it's very important to adopt ongoing the classroom work. The third one, informing the students about learning goals. How? At the very beginning of each period, I must inform my students about our objectives. Why? By the end of the period, I will impose questions to assess our objectives. Again, what's the importance of the formative assessment? It's a process that gives you good reflection about the students' learning. It should be used ongoing classroom work. Also, it informs the students about their goals. Continuing talking about the importance of the formative assessment that is being used ongoing or continuously in our sessions. It builds the learner's self-confidence as a learner. How? Of course, the teachers who used to ask the students regularly, they could feel this point. When I ask my students, I instill self-confidence in my students. Those who are neglected, they have lack of self-confidence. That's why the formative assessment builds our students' self-confidence. Also, the learner's results create lifelong learner. Please, if you have any questions, you can write it down, and by the end of the workshop, I will answer all questions. If I could hear any questions, please. Thank you. Again, lifelong learners is a good result of the formative assessment. When I ask my students, I push him, I motivate him to be lifelong learner. He will learn because he knows that in the next period, in the next session, he will be asked. So you instill the culture of being what? Lifelong learner. Learners' results are descriptive feedback, and this is very important point concerning the formative assessment. When we attend some sessions in other schools or in our school, we notice that most of the teachers used to give feedback to the students. Great, it's right, a good answer. But I'd like to attract our attention as a team. When one of the students gives you wrong answer, don't say loudly wrong. Please, we have to be positive with our learners. We said, good try, try again, keep up, and so on. But we mustn't be negative with our students. So that's why the formative assessment is a good tool to push our students as it gives them feedback about their performance, whether it is right or whether the student has a point that should be improved. Formative assessment is a process of obtaining information. What's the importance? It helps us as educators, as teachers, as coordinators, as principals to make decisions about engaging students, self-assessment, what should we do for the success of our students, Also, the formative assessment is a good sign of self-regulated learners. They can assess themselves. It engages the students in communicating with all stakeholders. It informs all stakeholders about the students' achievements and the points to be improved or should be improved. How can we set if we need to change our teaching strategy? Through formative assessment, because when you ask your students, you evaluate your students, then you can have, as a teacher, self-assessment. Is this weakness point as a result of the student's performance or as a result of my performance as a teacher? I neglected some points. I left a very important point without more clarification. There was a vague point, but I didn't cover it well. So the formative assessment will attract the teacher to improve his performance and also to improve the student's performance. Again, formative assessment helps teachers to make decisions about learners. How? When I assess the student's performance and my performance as a teacher, it guides me what should I do with the learner to answer well. We come to the next point, the curriculum. When we first review the curriculum, the content, and we make the alignment between the content, I mean the curriculum, and the standards, then start teaching our students, then we make formative assessment. After finishing or adopting the assessment, we can decide, is this curriculum enough for our students' improvement or we need more? If we need more, as our school has done, we start creating supplementary with the book, like what happened in the case of the booklets. Also, we need to improve the programs. We feel that this point is not enough, like what the math teacher has made upgrade because he felt that the book is not enough. That's why he started creating or developing specific program to improve the students' skills. Also, we need to modify or keep it as it is, our educational policy, based on the formative assessment results. Sometimes we feel that we have a lot of quizzes, so we must make it less, or we have less quizzes, we must make them more. What gives us this indication? The formative assessment. When we assess the students, then we come to measure the students' results with the curriculum, with the programs, with the supplementary programs, with the educational policy. That's why we must adopt the formative assessment regularly, because my sincere advice to my brothers and sisters, we must assess our students regularly because it will, we will get a lot of benefit out of these kinds of assessments with our students. Assessment, as we see through the discussion, starts with the gauge, a tool of learners' performance, and ends with identifying points of strength and points of weakness or points to be improved on the part of the students. Now, I've mentioned it quickly because I know that it's Saturday today, but we finished the importance of the assessment and the differences between the two kinds of assessment, formative and summative. Now, the most important question: what should we do to implement formative or summative assessment? I mean, what should we do to develop, to create an effective assessment? We need a volunteer, then we continue. What should we do to adopt, to develop, to create an effective assessment? Only one volunteer, please. What should we do to develop effective assessment? Do we have?
Define the area that need to be assessed, and then create a design to how will you assess this, how it will be measured, how it will be assessed. I think.
Great. Measured on what? Based on what? I mean the measurement. Based on what?
Based on my objective. My objective is for the yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr.
Okay, Mr. Muhammad.
Yes. Yes, we have to assess about. We have types of objectives like emotional objectives, skills, and knowledge. Okay, we have to follow Bloom taxonomy to assess the students in the understanding, comprehension, knowledge, synthetic. Okay, so we have to use the Bloom taxonomy to assess the student.
Thank you so much, Mr. Muhammad. To assess our students, first of all, we have the worldwide or the international standards. How can we set the knowledge level, as Mr. Muhammad has mentioned, but I'll explain it in details. We have Bloom's taxonomy. Taxonomy is a famous educator. In 1956, he developed the 6 levels of knowledge. That's why they called higher order thinking skills. So knowledge is the lower order thinking skill, evaluating higher order thinking skills. The old version starts with, as you see, these are the 6 knowledge, 6 levels of knowledge developed by Bloom in 1956. The first level, we ask or we evaluate knowledge. The second, we evaluate comprehension. The third, we evaluate application. Then we evaluate analysis. We evaluate synthesis. Then evaluating the highest order thinking skill. In 2001, we have taxonomy revised or revised taxonomy or Bloom's taxonomy for teaching, learning, and assessment. You could notice the change here. Knowledge, the new educator in 2001, knowledge becomes remembering. Comprehension, understanding. Application, change it to be applying. Analysis, analysis or analyzing. Synthesis, evaluating. You see the change. And evaluating becomes creating. First of all, I'd like you to notice here, they changed the nouns into verbs. To remember, to understand, to apply, to analyze, to evaluate, to create. This is the revised version or the new version of Bloom's taxonomy. So that's why when we say, when you assess your students, you must assess the different levels of knowledge. Sometimes we focus only on the lowest one. What's the capital of Saudi Arabia? What's the city? How long does it take? And so on. So only we are in remembering, but we must ask, evaluate our students in all levels of knowledge. My second question, and very important, if I want to ask about remembering, what should I ask our students? So here, the most important part in our workshop today, the implementation of assessment, how to develop an effective assessment based on the different levels of knowledge. So here we have the different 6 levels of knowledge that we must assess our students based on all these different levels. What should we do to ask about remembering? What should we do, or what should we use to ask about applying, and so on?
Yes, Mr. Khalid.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Muhammad, you can. Regarding remembering, you can talk with me, Mr. Muhammad.
Yes.
Regarding remembering, you can ask about what? Recalling relevant knowledge from long-term memory. You ask to assess the student's ability to remember. I mean, memorization.
Yes, like define, mention the formula. Okay, give reason.
Give reason to ask remembering, Mr. Muhammad?
Yes, reasons of something.
Give reason to ask about remembering?
Yes, this for remembering and understanding together. Okay, but yani to measure the recognizing, I think define, mention, what is the formula? Yes, like this.
Okay, I can add something, Mr. Khalid.
Okay, sure. Who's talking?
Mr. Saad.
Okay, Mr. Saad, with pleasure.
Okay, regarding to remembering, I can ask the student about the main concepts, definitions, theorems, and also the scientific terms, the scientific facts. Also, in the according to multiplication table, something like that.
Okay.
I will ask about abstract concept, theoretical learning, something like this.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Saad.
You're welcome.
Let's continue. Remembering means recalling relevant knowledge from long-term memory. Understanding, making sense of what you have learned. That's why you ask about understanding. Applying, what does it mean? To use the knowledge gained in a new way or in new ways. Analyzing, breaking the concept into parts and understand how each part is related to one another. Evaluating, to evaluate, what does it mean? Making judgments based on a set of guidelines. Creating, this is the highest level of knowledge, to put information together in an innovative way. Some educators said that we have to limit the points. They changed Bloom's taxonomy, the 6 different levels, into 3 cognitive levels. The first level is the lowest one, and the third level is the highest one. They said level 1 is to measure, to evaluate the skill of remembering. Level 2, they said that there is a good relationship between understanding and applying. That's why they put them together in level 2. And to analyze, you will be able to evaluate. Once you are able to evaluate, you will be able to create. That's why they said the highest cognitive level is the third one. That includes analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Even we can use this cognitive level or different 3 levels to evaluate our students when we develop our questions based on the cognitive level. I've done my best to collect the verbs that we can use to evaluate the 6 levels of knowledge. You can take photo of the next 2 slides, very important. As you see here, remembering, understanding, applying, these are the first 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I mean the revised one. Let's define remembering. It's reading information, recognizing, listening, describing, naming, finding. These are the different definitions of remembering. What are the verbs that we can use here to evaluate the first level? You can use here, as you see, choose, define, describe, give examples, okay? Know, label, list, match, memorize, name, quote, recall, means remember. These are the different verbs that we use to use them to evaluate the first level of knowledge. Can we use it in assessment? Yes, you can say define, label, list, okay? Question stems, like the question at the last column here. What happened after? So I'm asking about recalling. How many? I'm asking about recalling. What is the capital? I'm asking about recalling. Who got, who did, and so on. Can you name which is true or false? Here I'm assessing, I'm evaluating the lowest level of knowledge. I mean, remembering. So if I were a teacher and I'm developing a question and they put the 6 levels of knowledge, if you want to measure the skill of knowledge concerning remembering, you can use any one of these questions. That's why I said it's very important to take a photo here, where it will help us developing the different kinds of assessment. Understanding. What does it mean, understanding? It means explaining ideas or concepts, interpreting, summarizing, paraphrasing, classifying, explaining. All these measures understanding, which is called in the old taxonomy, as we discussed it, they change it from a noun into a verb, from comprehension to understand. What are the process verbs that we can use? As you see here, a lot of verbs: ask, calculate, describe, discuss. All these verbs to assess the second level of knowledge, which is understanding. How can we develop a question? As you see, can you write in your own words to test your ability of understanding? How would you explain to test your ability of understanding? What would happen if, what could happen if, to test your ability of understanding, and so on. We come to the third level of knowledge, applying. What does it mean? The third level of knowledge: using information in another familiar situation, implementing, carrying out, doing, I mean, using, executing, doing. What are the verbs? As you see, adapt, apply, calculate, change, demonstrate, draw. If I want to develop a question to measure the third level of knowledge, for example here, do you know of another instance where? Can you group? Group here is a verb, of course. Which factors would you change? What questions would you ask of? All these questions are the impact of evaluating, applying. So when I develop a quiz, I have to set the different 6 levels of knowledge. Then next to each level of knowledge, I write down the verbs that I will use to evaluate this level of knowledge. What about the other 3 ones? Analyzing, evaluating, and creating the highest one. To define the fourth level of knowledge means breaking information into parts to explore understandings and relationships. What are the verbs that I use to evaluate the fourth level of knowledge? Means analyzing, to analyze, calculate, categorize, classify, compare, contrast, diagram, differentiate, discover, group. I make them, put them into groups, and so on. Investigate, order, question, relate, research. If we want to make a question, which events could not have happened? How is, then I mention, similar to. What are some other outcomes? So here again, we define the level of knowledge. We mention some of the verbs that are used to evaluate this level of knowledge. Then we give examples how to evaluate this level of knowledge. The fifth one, evaluating. What's the definition? Justifying a decision or course of action, checking, hypothesizing, criticizing, judging. What are the verbs? As you see, argue, choose, compare, criticize, declare, decide, defend, evaluate, justify. We need examples. Is there a better solution to? Here you are evaluating. What do you think about? And so on. So again, the fifth level of knowledge, evaluating. We have the verbs that we use to evaluate the fifth level of knowledge and some examples. What about the last one? Creating. This is the outcome of the 6 levels of knowledge, creating. Creating means generating new ideas, producing new ideas, designing new ideas, constructing, planning, and so on. What are the verbs that I can use to evaluate the last level, I mean the 6th level of knowledge? Act, arrange, assemble, combine, compose, construct, create, and so on. Examples: can you design a to? Can you see a possible solution to? How would you devise your own way to? And so on. In short, to develop. In short, to develop an assessment, I have to go back to Bloom's taxonomy that consists of 6 levels of knowledge. It's one level of these kinds of different knowledge has its own verbs, and we gave examples about how to implement evaluating the different levels of knowledge. Then we have another kind of evaluators or educators who invented DOK. What's DOK? Abbreviation for depth of knowledge. They divided the knowledge into 4 levels, not 6 as Bloom's, but also having the same skills. Level 1 means recall, memorizing. What are the key words to use here? I mean the key verbs. To ask about recalling, I mean the first level of DOK, identify, recall, use, measure. It's basic recall of information, memorizing, memorization. Ask about a fact, about a definition, about a term. It requires the students to follow a formula or recipe to ask about recalling. Level 2, measures, skills, and concepts. It's complete multiple steps in order to find a solution, requires the students to make informed decisions about problem solving and procedures. What are the key verbs or the key words? Classify, organize, estimate, collect, and so on. So if we want to evaluate the second level of DOK, I use these verbs. If you want to evaluate the first level of DOK, I use identify, recall, use, and so on. What about the third level? Strategic thinking, reasoning, planning, using evidence, or a higher level of thinking. It requires the students to draw conclusions from their observations. So they use justify, explain, draw conclusions to evaluate the third level of strategic thinking. What about the highest one and the last one? The fourth level, extended thinking, means the complex reasoning, developing or thinking over a period of time. What does it require, the fourth level? The fourth level requires the students to design and conduct an experiment. What are the key verbs? Relate, make, connections, make connections. To sum up, Bloom's taxonomy that was developed in 1956, and it was modified or reviewed in 2001, or recently the educators who have developed DOK, you see they start from lower thinking skills to high order thinking skills. So it's very important when we develop an assessment, it should cover the different levels of knowledge. This is very important. Now, to sum up, we mentioned the different kinds of assessment, the importance of each kind of assessment, whether it is formative and summative. What should we do to develop an effective assessment based on the different levels of knowledge, whether old taxonomy, revised taxonomy, or DOK. To have an educational policy, we should have assessment plan. How? You see here at the very beginning of the academic year, our school has done the diagnostic assessment. It measures the students' ability. It measures their learning strategies. Some used to be good through visualizing, others through communications, and so on. So these are the diagnostic. We mentioned the form of the assessment. What are our goals out of this assessment? Okay. What's the impact of the assessment and the results, whether it is formative, summative, or diagnostic. So it's very important to mention our objectives or our goals out of our assessment. Now we are asked to develop the final exam, the final assessment of our students. What are our objectives? We need a volunteer. Now, we are asked to develop an assessment, the final exam of the first semester. What are our objectives? Because we will depend on these objectives to develop the assessment. Only one volunteer, please.
I can answer.
Okay.
To give them an assessment that assess the skills. Yes.
Okay.
That assess the skills that must be covered in the first term, skills that they will take them to the second term.
Where can we have these skills, Ms. Angie?
Sorry?
Where can we have these skills that we will depend on them to develop our assessment?
From the anchor standards.
Yes.
from the
And the
Common Core
international
State
or
10.
worldwide standards. Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Even the homework is a kind of assessment, as we said. What kind of assessment, the homework? Formative or summative?
Formative.
Great.
Formative.
Thank you. Yes, of course,
Yes.
because it
You are
measures
welcome.
the students' understanding of our
Yes.
lessons. Yes.
Yeah, continuous assessment. Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
You are
This
welcome.
is the video. I will skip it. To have a good assessment, we must cover the test standards. We have 5 test standards we must take into consideration when we develop an assessment. Number 1, my test should be valid. The validity of the quiz. What does it mean, the validity of the quiz? It means each assessment, each exam should measure, as you see, should measure what it was designed to measure. For example, I developed my assessment to measure, for example, the first 3 standards. So the questions must ask about these 3 standards. This is what we mean by the validity of the assessment. So before I develop the assessment, set the skills that you want to measure, to ask about, to make sure that our students could have achieved. Number 2, test reliability. The test must be reliable. What does it mean? I mean, different quizzes at different times should have the different results. For example, I'll give my students of grade 4 the assessment this week. The second week, I'll give the assessment to grade 4. Both of them received the same knowledge. So the results must be the same or near. This is what is meant by the reliability of the assessment. Same different versions measuring same skills and knowledge. Again, same different versions measuring the same skills and knowledge. I will make a version for grade 4A, for example, or for B, 2 different versions, but they must measure the same skills. They must measure the same levels of knowledge. This is what is meant by the test reliability. Third, objectivity of the assessment or the objectives. Each single question must have only one answer. Again, the objectivity of the assessment, each single question must have only one single answer. This is what we mean by test objectivity. Unbiased. My test never be for students of same color or from students who have lower income or who have some specific background or environment and so on. We mustn't be biased to students. We must be fair. The next one, never give unfair advantages by pushing somebody to start. We must be fair with all students. The assessment must be fair. Fair means I must, this is very important sentence. Students must be assessed on what they have been taught. Again, students must be assessed on what they have been taught. I mustn't ask my students about something that I didn't explain, or I didn't clarify, or I didn't focus. The assessment must be fair. I think these 5 points entitled test standards are very important when developing or writing our assessment for our students. The activity has been designed because I had planned before to have this workshop at school. That's why I will skip it, but we will read it together quickly. Make a formative assessment on the following. It's supposed that I prepared a printed paper for teachers in different subjects. After formative assessment, actively encourage your students to self-assess or peer assess. How? Now you assessed our students in our session, asking them questions. Ahmed, what is the capital of Saudi Arabia, for example? He answered, Mahmoud, is it right? So here we can create self-assessment in our environment or peer-to-peer assessment in our environment. This is a tool to gauge, to ensure quality of education. What are the main features of formative assessment? To sum up, to end our discussion about formative assessment, then we discuss the summative, then we discuss together the implementation. The main characteristics of formative, it's effective questioning. It gives the student feedback about his performance. Okay, we have self-assessment and peer assessment that will ensure quality education. It closes the gaps in the students' performance. It improves the student's knowledge because he receives feedback on the spot. So again, please, if we ask the students, we must give them feedback about their answers during the session. That's why formative assessment is so effective. If we don't do these points, so the formative assessment is ineffective, not effective. There is a big difference between the assessment kind and assessment tools. When you want to assess your students, you have to use different tools to assess. I mean, a variety of tools to assess our students, like observations, questioning, discussion, and we have a lot of tools also to ask our students about, clarify, multiple choice, true or false. All these are tools to evaluate. Exit admit slips. This is a good technique to ask our students, especially or specifically in the last part of our session, I mean the practice part or the practical part. Admit or admit slips, exit, you give the students a piece of paper asking them to answer, to clarify, to support their answers using why, what would have happened, and so on. This technique participates in instilling the culture of critical thinking questions on the part of our students. As you see, it's one of the formative assessment tools that give teachers a way to assess how well students understand the material they are learning in class. This tool can be used daily or weekly, depending on the unit being taught. You give him a question and give him a piece of paper, write down your answer, support your answer, support your opinion, and so on. Clarify your answers. It's simply a question posed to all students prior to class ending. Very important. prior to class ending. Before the session ends, I ask my students, I give them this paper to write down. Virtually, I ask them to write down and show me the answer or to upload on the dashboard. But it's very important to ensure that your students could understand the lesson. It's very important to end your lesson asking the question, a question based on your objectives to check, to measure your students' understanding of the lesson. If you want to make sure that they could understand, set the last 7 minutes, the last 6 minutes to ask them about your objectives. I mean, the questions will be based on your objectives to make sure that they could understand your knowledge. So formative assessment is so important. It participates, it pushes the students to understand, it gives you a good reflection about the students' performance and understanding. Now we come to summative. We said at the very beginning, when we differentiate between formative and summative, we said summative happens at the end of the unit, at the end of the chapter, at the end of the month, at the end of the semester, at the end of the year. Why? To assess the students' knowledge, to measure the students' competency. What does it mean? To measure the students' ability to do something. It measures the outcome of the unit or the chapter. That's why we say it's given periodically to determine at a particular point in time what students know and don't know. So, formative assessment can't be known to the students, but summative must be known. The students must know in advance the timing of the summative assessment, because it measures the whole knowledge of the unit or the whole unit of the chapter, or I mean the knowledge he is supposed to get, or the skills he is supposed to acquire and achieve. So again, summative is given periodically to determine at a particular point in time. They must be informed in advance, particular point in time, what students know and don't know. We notice here that we have a lot of resources of summative assessments. We see the standardized tests. They measure the knowledge of the whole content, that we must depend on the standardized tests to measure our students' competency or to measure our students' ability to do something or to understand and to achieve some specific skills in his or their real life. This is a good resource for summative assessment, the standardized tests. Again, summative assessment, it does happen, end of unit or chapter tests, end of term, scores that are used for the accountability for school and students. It appears, for example, in the report cards for grades. To show the importance of the summative assessment again, it's a gauge, a tool at a particular time. Okay, it means a gauge at a particular time to measure the student's learning relative to the content standard. So here we have the international standards, we have the content, we make the alignment, I mean the connectedness between the standards and the content. Now it's the time to measure whether our students could achieve these skills or not. So this is the significance of the summative assessment. I have just mentioned this. It measured the competency, I mean the ability to do something. If we want to compare between the two different kinds, then we will see the implementation. Formative assessment. It's an assessment for learning. I mean assessment for students' understanding. Summative assessment of learning, assessment to check the student's competency, I mean the ability to do something. Formative takes place during instruction, during teaching. Summative takes place after teaching. The formative is a descriptive feedback to the students. It gives him feedback about his performance. It measures the goals where you are. You do what you want to achieve. Whether summative puts the students in the center of learning. It promotes the students from chapter to the next one. It promotes the students from one grade level to the next one. It promotes the students from one semester to the next one. That's why we said at a particular time. He must be informed in advance. Formative, it can use any type of assessment tools. Also the summative, I mean here, the different tools to assess our students. True or false, WH questions, multiple choice, and so on. We can use all the different tools in formative and summative. But what's the difference? The question itself. Here it measures understanding, there it measures students' competency. How will we assess our students this year? Also, this activity, it's supposed to be in class last week, but we will skip it. How to analyze assessment. This is the most important part in our workshop today. How we analyze assessment. As you see, this slide is a sample to the international standards. I mean the academic standards. Reading, this is the strand, subject English. Reading literature, this is the heading. Key ideas and details, this is the subheading. RL1, reading literature 1, I mean the first standard in RL, reading literature. What does it say? It's clear in front of us. Read closely to determine what the text says explicitly, and so on. If we want to implement this standard in K, you have these performance indicators that must be done. If we want to implement this standard in grade 1, you have to implement these performance indicator, and so on. So it goes up. The skills, the benchmarking goes up from each grade level to the next one. You see here in KG, you go up a little bit to achieve the skill in grade 1, and so on. You see here in grade 4, for example, refer to details and examples in a text when explaining what the text says explicitly and when drawing inferences from the text. What about grade 5? You see something more. This is the progression of the skills. I think I have done it and I shared it with the teachers. You see here, quote accurately, then refer to the text. So here referring to the text, and here we talk about quotation. That's why when I discussed the intervention programs with the teachers, I said we depend on the skills in the standards to cover the weakness points on the students' performance. So when we improve the students' reading, it's not enough to tell the students to read this sentence. No, we are not covering reading skills in this case. So please go back to the standard, go back to the skills in each standards. This will guide us what should we do to make effective innovation programs, whether in math, English, or science. What is the journey of assessment? First of all, we set our worldwide standards. This is the very important point at the very beginning of the year. That's why we discussed this point in our first workshop. We set our standards. After setting our standards, we worked on the educational program. We set what are the required skills. Then we start assessing our students based on our instruction. I mean, based on our teaching. After making the assessment, we analyze the students' results. This is what we have already done. Then we start creating the remedial classes or the intervention programs. So the intervention programs is the impact of the students' result analysis. That's why I said, when we start making the remedial classes for our students in English and math, and we haven't covered all the weakness points. Why? Because we are working on the analysis of the students' performance. When we say they are, I don't want to the word weak, they have some points in reading that should be improved. Also, they have some points in reading and writing that should be improved. We worked on reading and we didn't work on writing. That's why we said, and we discussed this point with a lot of teachers, please cover writing in your intervention programs, please. So the remedial is the impact of the result analysis. How can we create an assessment based on the standards? Look here. You can take a photo of this slide because it will guide us when we develop an assessment based on the standards. Here, for example, subject English, strand reading, for example, grade 4, question number 1, RL2 means reading literature standard number 2. What does the standard say? Determine central ideas or themes of a text and analyze their development. Summarize the key supporting details and ideas. So here in this standard, we have two skills. Also, I want math teacher, science teacher to do the same. Analyze your standard. I mean, dissect it or dissect it, both are correct. Dissect it means make it into a lot of details. What are the required skills in this standard? In this standard, we have two skills. A, determine central ideas or themes. This is A, determine theme of a story, drama, or poem from the details in the text. What's the second skill? Summarize using key details from the text. If I want to develop an assessment measuring this standard, it will be like this. Who can tell us, a volunteer, if we want to implement this standard in our assessment, what should we do or what should we say? Okay. Like this. This is the standard. Determine the central ideas of theme of a text and analyze their development. Summarize the key supporting details and ideas. You see the question? Write the theme of this story. For example, The Innocent Boy. Write the theme, mention the theme, talk about the theme. So here we are asking about the first skill in this standard. What about the second one? Summarize. Summarize the story, writing the details that support the story theme. So if you want to measure the students' skills in implementing standard RL2, the question may be like this. Write the theme. So here you are assessing the different two skills in this standard. What's the next point after making the assessment? We correct, then we analyze the student performance. It will be like this. In all subjects, by the way, how to analyze the assessment. Here, students' names. Skill A in question 1. I have 3 students, got 3 out of 3. But in skill B, they got 1 out of 3. This means that they are weak in what? If we go back to skill B, summarize the story, writing the details that support the story theme. Write the equation. Write the experiment. I'm discussing different subjects here. Write the experiment. What have you observed and what is the outcome of this experiment? You are assessing your students to ensure that they could understand the standard and implement and acquire the different skills in this standard. So here you are analyzing the assessment. What happens after these kinds of analysis? Starting the remedial. So here we could set that they are weak. They have a skill that should be improved here. What was it? Summarizing, writing the details in relation to the theme of the story. So here, a suggested remedial plan for our students. This must be done during our intervention programs that are being done these days. I mentioned the skill. Okay, standards, for example, skill how to summarize using text details. What's the work that has been done? Extra worksheets, discussions, presentations, etc. What's the result after assessing our students in our intervention sessions or intervention programs? The outcome, the result, will give us the effectiveness of our intervention plans. I've done my best to explain and to discuss quickly, because I know this is Saturday. Some of our colleagues told me today, please quickly, we have to finish because we have a lot of work. That's why I remodified the workshop to fit only 1.5 hours. Thank you so much for your participation. I have finished the assessment workshop. To wrap up, we talked about the different 2 kinds of assessment, We mentioned the importance of each kind. When does each kind of assessment or when are these 2 kinds of assessment implemented? How to develop a question based on the standards, how we make the students' performance analysis, then what's the impact or the next step of the analysis that should be on the remedial classes, and what should be done during our intervention classes. Again, thank you so much. I appreciate your attendance. Hope that we shared our experience concerning assessment. If you want the slides, it will be sent. Thank you so much for your participation. I have got a lot of benefits of our participation together, and your participation, your discussion, those talented who discussed and those who haven't discussed. Inshallah, if you want the slides, it will be printed and sent to you. Thank you so much. If you want to mention anything, it's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Khalid.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Khalid.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Khalid. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Khalid.
Mr. Khalid.
Had a good time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. See you, inshallah. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إن شاء الله نتقابل في ورشة قريبة إن شاء الله بإذن الله. اشوفكم على خير ان شاء الله. السلام عليكم ورحمه الله وبركاته.